From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, August 8th. Australia has the highest extinction rate of mammals in the world. But what does this erasure actually do to us? It's more profound than many of us realize. It's not just that our country has lost 33 species of its unique mammals since colonisation in 1788. Their eradication has also changed the wider environment in which we live, even changed what we and our children know to be true about the world. Today, National Environment and Climate Editor Nick O'Malley on how one group of conservationists has built a veritable time machine to save native animals, and the once-derided tools it's used to get the job done. So Nick, you've written this piece that describes so vividly how protecting native animals can profoundly shift how we actually understand the country we live in. So can you tell us about this sort of insane fence that has been built in the far north of the country and how it works? Because as you've written, it operates as something of a time machine that can offer us glimpses of an Australia that existed before Europeans arrived.
So the fence is on a former cattle station called Newhaven, which is about 350 kilometres northwest of Alice Springs in, as you can imagine, some really spectacular arid red landscape. The former cattle station, which is owned and managed by AWC, being the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and traditional owners, is a lot larger than the fenced area. The fenced area sits within it. And inside the fenced area, apart from the spinifex and bloodwoods and desert oaks that you'd expect, there is also this really dramatic spine of an old weathered mountain range, which is known as the McDonald Ranges. So that runs through the centre, through the middle of this fenced area. So they have all these different micro ecosystems. And then there's the fence, and it's designed to keep out introduced predators in particular, and specifically cats and foxes.
And I'd love you to paint a picture for us about this fence. I mean, you've mentioned, of course, it's not like your traditional sort of agricultural fence, but it actually runs for 44 kilometres, and the power that sort of thrums through it, as you've written, is massive. So can you take us through this?
Well, in the middle of nowhere is this quite fearsome structure. It stands about 2 metres tall. There's a couple of layers of mesh on it. There's motion sensors on it. There's cameras on all the gates. When you're near the gates, when you're near the machinery, I suppose, that operates it, you hear this constant thrum of 8,000 volts going through it. It's a regular pulse you can hear when you stand near the main gate. And I think in the first Jurassic Park, someone observed when we were there, that was 10,000 volts. So they're determined that nothing gets through.
Which leads us to the conservation efforts that you've written about, specifically the work that the Australian Wildlife Conservancy is undertaking at Newhaven. The ecologists there told you that the land has degraded over the years, but that it could be restored to health. So are there any signs that this has actually happened?
Look, not at a grand scale. Australia has a good system of national parks, but they're full of feral animals. They're not protected like this. So anything that exists inside the fence is, for the first time in 100 years or more, living outside in pursuit of cats and foxes. But it's not just removing the predators, I should say that. They also reintroduce fire, as it once would have existed in the landscape. And they really do hard work in removing introduced plants as well. So it's a huge renovation to the landscape. As they started building these large areas and fencing them and then going in and shooting all the predators inside them, was that once you remove the predators, everything changes. It's not just that they can do their core work, which is re-releasing the small animals that once existed there but have gone extinct, things like marla and bettongs. But they find everything changes.
That's science in action. Just wants to get in position. Try to get closer.
Because those animals, and similar animals in other areas where they've done the same thing, they tend to dig and burrow. They're soil engineers, and once they start engineering that soil, which they do at an incredible scale, then the soil becomes more fertile. It leaves divots and cups in the soil, which receives and carries moisture when there is rain out there, and it becomes more fertile. It captures the seeds of the brushes and trees. One of the blokes I was there with who explained this really beautifully was Joey Clark, an ecologist and science communicator with the AWC.
And here we're just seeing them coming back.
Yeah, so the restoration here means that not only for these endangered species, they've got a chance at survival, but also they're restoring those ecological processes like digging, burrowing, feeding up different plants. So it's improving the health of the ecosystem at the same time as helping prevent them going extinct.
So you begin to get a return to those scrubs. Once that scrub exists, you get a return of insects. Then you get the lizards and the reptiles which chase them. Then you get the birds which prey upon the lizards and insects. So the entire landscape pretty quickly starts changing, and it starts looking a little bit like it may have looked before we arrived.
I've been working with AWC for about 10 years, and this is the most critical weight range endangered mammals I've ever seen in a day. We've had close encounters with marla down near the camp. We've seen brush-tailed bettongs driving up to this trapping site. And just here we've caught, I think it was 7 burrowing bettongs at one site, at one warren system. So this place is really full of mammals now. It's absolutely, they're flourishing in this cat-free safe haven. It's pretty exciting.
And it's interesting to me, this fence. You've written about the significance of it because fences were actually once regarded with suspicion by some Australian ecologists. Like you say, after all, a fenced animal is no longer truly a wild one. And I think this points to sort of just how dire the decline of native species in Australia is. So can you sort of explain to us how and when the numbers of native species started to decline? And how come Australia has the highest extinction rate of mammals in the world?
Australian native animals are just not prepared for cats and foxes. If you consider where they come from and where they're common, or animals like them, it's through Asia, North America and Europe. And if you want the full story, I'll be quick, but over tens of thousands of years, North America and Europe was joined and then separated by an ice shelf. At those periods, any predators on either continent could escape across and infiltrate those two massive areas, and they get down into Asia. That never happened in Australia. It grew up in splendid isolation. And as a result, small Australian animals have no instincts within them to escape from a predator. Someone once showed me what it was like when you stamped your foot near a bilby and it sort of ducked off a metre and then froze. That's just lunch to a cat, as you can imagine. So as soon as cats and foxes arrived, they just ran rampant. They just took off across the continent and they really rapidly started wiping out species. But the real collapse has happened, sadly enough, of many of these species in many of our own lifetimes. I interview one of Australia's leading ecologists in that story who describes the forests falling quiet in his professional life from the 1980s to now. I think I also mentioned there that the last quolls were found in the eastern suburbs in the 50s or 40s. So this has happened really quickly. It was pointed out to me that with colonisation, the landscape didn't just suffer from the introduction of feral species, but it lost these communities that cared for the land in ways that Europeans are only beginning to understand now. The AWC works with traditional owners everywhere in the country where there is a community that's close and that has an interest and a connection with the land, and that's specifically the case at Newhaven, where there is a very strong community there, and they have built close ties with the AWC, and I think many of its community members are working as rangers with the AWC.
And I think you've written that 39 mammal species have disappeared since colonisation in 1788, representing over a third of global mammal losses. I mean, that's just...
It is. And so over the years, there were some people who, would have proposed fences. But I think a lot of ecologists believe, no, we have to protect all the animals. We can't just have these tiny little fences, because these arcs, as I call them, they are just tiny. They're not proper landscapes. But over the years, it came to realise this is the last chance for many of these animals. So, the fences are now regarded as the last best option.
Something really sinister about that is that the impact of all of this animal loss, it leads to a concept I'd never heard of called shifting baseline syndrome, which means that each new generation believes that the environment they grew up in is normal. And This sounds dystopian to me. It sort of reminded me like of something out of a Ray Bradbury novel. Fahrenheit 451, books are burnt, and as a result, basic facts of life have been forgotten. So can you sort of tell us about this?
I just couldn't resist putting that in. It was one of the terms I came across in the research for the piece, and it's not specific to this story. But to me it explained a lot, particularly about climate change. But what it really is observing is that the world we grow up in, to us, seems perfectly normal, but it might not be. So, for example, if the last quolls were lost in the eastern suburbs of Sydney in the 1950s, to someone born in 1955, a landscape without quolls is perfectly normal. But to anyone over the past 10,000 years or more, quolls were part of the landscape. Now, if you observe that across all species, and, in my work, I often think about this now in terms of climate, that the climate we exist with now is not normal. But it would be normal for a young person today to think that this climate is normal. And that has a profound effect on how we react. If we are not jarred by the loss or the threat, then there is less impetus for us to act.
And so there are dozens of feral, predator-free areas across Australia. But arguably the establishment of these sites is an attempt at compensation for the record-breaking land clearing in the States, which has been cited as the number one threat to Australia's wildlife, as stated by the State of the Environment reports. So can you tell us, I guess, a bit about this? Because Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek, since taking office, has vowed no new extinctions. And she's updated the Threatened Species Action Plan. But is this actually realistic considering our current land clearing practices?
No, if we keep land clearing and if we keep logging in native forests, we're likely to keep losing vulnerable species that depend on those habitats. To be clear, these fenced areas, which are slowly being embraced by some state governments as well, they're not a direct response to government plans, and they're often supported by private groups, but they are a response to that loss of species. Look, the fences are really expensive to establish, and the land has to be purchased to put them on. But once you've built this expensive fence, there's a lot more to it than that. The land in and around these things is really intensively managed. There are people in there burning constantly. There are people in there controlling the weeds. There are cameras put on every fence. There are motion sensors. Then there are traditional owners who are working in concert with the ecologists. And then there are the scientists who are releasing the animals and then tracking the populations and measuring their movements as they grow and change. So it's not just a one-off investment, it's an ongoing investment, which, as some people I spoke to as I researched this pointed out, that governments can be reluctant to make. What's happened since Tanya Plibersek made that very admirable promise is that she's sought to have what is called the EPBC Act reformed. This is the Environmental Protection Act, the main piece of legislation that is meant to do this. That's been delayed. It was meant to come out in the first year. That hasn't happened. The plans that you mentioned exist within the EPBC Act. So there is a lot of disappointment among environmental groups that there hasn't been faster action. And even if there was action, we need every tier of government and we need a heap more money than we're currently spending. I think the last research I looked at said we'd need something like $1.7 to $2 billion a year spent if we were to try and end extinctions. So if Australia is to turn this around, it's going to need a massive, massive effort, and not just from the federal government.
Thank you, Nick, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.